And welcome to this video on this Easter weekend. I am going to be sharing with you why I am a Christian. Now, there's two sides of the story. There's two parts of this. First of all, why I think Christianity is true from the perspective of propositions. But there's, of course, the second section. This is why I want to live as a Christian. Because it's one thing to accept a set of propositions, God exists, or oh, Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. It's another thing to say, well, actually, I want to follow this moral compass. I want to accept this worldview as part of my life. So I'll be touching upon these two aspects. And I'll start off with the propositions because it's kind of more cut and dry. I will not, when it comes to apologetics and when it comes to natural theology, I very rarely want to make wide sweeping statements to say, oh, natural theology or apologetics has proven the existence of God, as if we suddenly have 100% proof for God's existence and everyone who disagrees with me is therefore irrational. That is not the intention or an impression that I want to give. Having studied a lot of these arguments myself, although of course this is not my area of research, I focus on 19th, 20th century post-Kantian philosophy and aspects in theology more. I think from a broad understanding of this topic, one can see there's reasonable people on both sides of the debate. There's very smart Christians, Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig. The list goes on. And there's also very smart atheist writers. For example, Graham Oppy. He is a very knowledgeable atheistic or agnostic thinker who does not think these arguments work. And as a result, I'm not going to sit here and say there's 100% certainty that a certain position is better than the other. However, I do believe that the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument at least provide good reason for someone to believe in the existence of God. Now, this might lead some people to be surprised. It's like, well, all right, there's good reason to believe in one proposition, then surely everyone who doesn't believe in this proposition must be irrational. But that is an overestimation and, of course, a metaphilosophical mistake that a lot of people make to say, well, oh, just because there are good reasons to believe in one hypothesis, that means no other hypothesis makes sense, or there's no reason to believe in anything else. When you look at things like the cosmological argument, to me, I think it makes sense. I've talked to Dr. Andrew Lokup, who card above, to his introduction to the Kalam cosmological argument, and I think it works. It says, well, whatever begins to exist has cause, therefore the universe began to exist. Well, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and that cause, therefore, must be highly powerful, has some form of free will, resembles something like the God of classical monotheism. And I think that's a relatively reasonable argument. Now, of course, I'm really skimming over this because there's no way I'm going to go through the whole argument here in this video. But I look at that and I'm like, well, that provides a good reason to think that there's a first cause and that it has some elements which resemble God of classical monotheism. But at the same time, there are ways that people have gotten out of it. For example, people accept that the universe is a brute fact. Now, I personally don't think that's a good explanation, especially when you look at other things like fine-tuning, which make, I think, the idea of it being a brute fact even more improbable, which I'll touch on fine-tuning later. But nonetheless, there are ways out of these arguments, or people accept infinite regresses. Now, do I think infinite regresses are possible? I think there are shortcomings to infinite regresses in reality, and this is something that I think even Graham Oppy accepts. He says, well, yeah, you might have a mathematically robust presentation of infinite regresses, but in practicality, these things, there's some problems when you're trying to apply that to the real world. But nonetheless, he recognizes that there are these options that people can take, which would reasonably allow someone to deny the conclusion of the cosmological argument. And the same goes to the fine-tuning argument. I've talked to Dr. Luke Barnes and Dr. Robin Collins on this issue on this channel as well. I'll put a card to that above. And they say, well, if we look at the scientific evidence behind the universe and the fine-tuned parameters of the universe, like natural laws, laws of nature, constants, gravitational constants, things like that, you notice that the sheer sliver of possibilities for the universe to sustain life in this present form is really, really, really small. So instead of saying, well, okay, this universe, the fact that it's life-sustaining, oh, it could have just been any old universe, the probability of it just being any old universe is so small that it would lead one to think that, well, actually, if we assume that the universe has its natural telos such that it's life-sustaining, well, there's a good reason to attribute that to a god. Now, people, of course, have responded by saying multiverse hypothesis. Maybe these laws of nature are necessary, But nonetheless, if you're looking at this in a cumulative case about, well, the existence of God, well, look at other arguments like the resurrection, which I'll touch upon in a few minutes' time, I think that whole picture is way more reasonable, that cumulative case is way more reasonable when you accept that God exists. Now, once again, I'm making it very clear here that I'm not saying this is 100% proof for God's existence. There are ways people can get out of the arguments. But at least with the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument, they definitely do, at least in my opinion, increase the probability of God existing to a significant degree, in which most people can look at that and say, well, it is a reasonable belief to believe that God exists. And once again, I'm not going to say this to say, well, all right, everyone who's an atheist is therefore unreasonable or irrational. This is not the argument I'm making. I think it's perfectly reasonable that some people might be atheists. For example, they might look at the problem of evil and say, oh, the problem of evil provides strong arguments against God. In the same way, they might look at me and say, well, all right, the problem of evil provides good reasons for someone to be an atheist, but it doesn't mean that someone's irrational to be a theist in light of the problem of evil, because there are ways out of the problem of evil, like theodicies, like skeptical theism, which allow people to get out of the problem of evil while still holding a consistent and reasonable worldview. And as a result, I guess this whole preface has been purely to tell you that I think it's reasonable to believe in God, and with extra evidence that I'm going to show you and reasons why I think it's a good explanation of the world, I become a Christian. But at the same time, I'm not saying this apologetics to say, well, all right, you must be a Christian, otherwise you're a complete idiot. That is not the intention. But then you say, okay, God exists. Well, and then what, right? Why Christianity? Well, I think there's a good reason to believe in the resurrection. I made a video with Dr. Andrew Lope. I'll put a card to that above, where he provides good reason for why we can have historical evidence for the resurrection of Christ. He says, well, all right, we have a few very well-established historical facts, like the fact that Jesus existed, that Jesus died, and Jesus was seen after his death. What are the best explanations for it? He says, well, were these appearances inside the mind? Were they hallucinations? Were they intramental or extramental? Well, the intramental hypothesis is very strong. It's all extramental. Now, okay, if they experienced something, well, what was it? Well, the evidence and the reasons or the explanation of that thing actually being the risen Christ is significantly higher because, people normally don't survive crucifixions, and people don't really just randomly appear. It's probably not a duplicate because these people lived with the guy a lot. And as a result, it provides good reason for someone to believe in the resurrection. Now, this is not to say, oh, I've 100% proved the resurrection. As I've said just now, there are ways people get out of it, and there have been responses, which I don't buy. I don't think those arguments are good, because there's responses like, oh, well, let's assume methodological naturalism. I don't think that's a good argument. I think it begs a question. People could say, well, all right, the probability of a collection of other cases, like maybe it's a duplicate plus someone stole the body plus all these alternate explanations, would still be higher than the idea of a resurrection happening. I don't think that's a good argument because, well, those things are highly improbable, and given the fact that we accept God exists from the previous arguments from the cumulative case, then it doesn't seem completely unreasonable to think that God would lead someone to rise from the dead. So, I think there's good reason to believe in the resurrection as well, and as a result, I propositionally would say, there's good reason to be a Christian. Now, does this prove 100%? Once again, I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't believe in Christianity is an idiot. That's not my argument here, but I do think there is good reason to believe in Christianity. But that only takes you so far, because I think it's a danger of a lot of people, especially on online communities, where everything just becomes an argument. It's completely impersonal. Everyone reads the natural theology textbooks, people read apologetics textbooks, people read tomes of theology, they read a bit of Aquinas, Summa Theologia, read the church fathers, and then they try to defeat everyone with rational facts and arguments. And I'm like, well, I think you're missing the point. I think you're making this intellectual inquiry an idol. You're idolizing it because you're just saying, well, or I don't really care about how I'm living my life. I'm just going to care about this defeating the atheists or defeating the Protestant or whoever your interlocutor is in this facts and arguments. And I think it's a completely empty and stupid and useless project. Not to say apologetics is useless. I think it's helpful. It's helped people develop their faith. But just trying to beat people in arguments with it, I think it goes a bit too far. I think people should care about why they should live their life in a Christian sense. Now, okay, if that's the case, then why should someone be Christian? Why should someone live in accordance with the Christian message? I think there's two main reasons for this. Firstly, I think it provides a very good explanation for moral lifestyle. I think a lot of the problems we see in society is a result of the fact that we're slowly falling away from Christianity. For example, firstly, good morals and values. The idea that we view each other with intrinsic value, we respect each other as human beings in this world, comes fundamentally from a Christian worldview. You go back in history, you don't need to go too far back to realize that human rights has been a very recent invention as this kind of concrete idea. It's there's slavery, all these things which were going around, abuses in World War II where people were mistreating prisoners of war and stuff like that. And you're like, well, all of this stuff is a result of people not valuing the lives of other people. But then with Christianity, you say, well, God has died for every single person, died for every single soul. Well, that's something that you have to hold up and say, well, if God's going to die for this person, I can't abuse the guy. If someone who's way greater than me is going to treat the guy with respect, I have to treat the guy with respect as well. And that's something which is unique to Christianity, which I don't think is a case with other religions. If you compare it to Judaism and you compare it to Islam and you compare it to things like Hinduism and Buddhism, you get certain arguments, I think, in Hinduism and Buddhism where you could be like, okay, I kind of see why that could be the case. If you accept some karmic reincarnation, then, well, everyone has equal soul. The soul of my soul is the same as the soul of a pig. But then if you go to things like Islam, I'm like, well, I'm not sure whether you can ground that intrinsic value in human life in the same degree. And it's definitely not supported in the same degree as it is with Christianity, because you have the idea of an incarnation and God dying for you, which is just not present in either Judaism or Islam. Now, with Hinduism, I think that could be an argument. But of course, then I think the idea of moral intuition stems in, where I say, yes, it's good that they grant value and put value to living things, but I think it goes a bit overboard when they're like, well, okay, the natural result of Buddhism or Hinduism should be some form of veganism because all souls have similar value in this karmic scale of reality. And I'm like, well, that just doesn't seem to match my moral intuitions. This is not me saying we should go abuse animals, but it's definitely to say, if someone asks me, would you rather have 500 animals die versus one person going to heaven? I'll choose that one person going to heaven all the time. And I think most people would agree with me. Their moral intuitions would agree with me. And as a result, I think the moral intuitions that we have, and this is another aspect of this, the moral intuitions that we have match that Christian picture more as well. And not only does it match the moral side of things, I think it matches the societal side of things as well, in the sense that Christianity is inherently anti-materialistic. We live in this kind of late capitalist world, and I know I'm using Marxist terminology here, and I'm not the biggest fan of Marx, but I think there are elements where Marx was right. He says, when people become too materialistic, when a society becomes too focused on capital, the values fundamentally change and people just become standing reserves. We just kind of view everyone as tools, devalues everything. And, I think Marx then problematically falls into that to then view everything as a form of utility. So that's another problem with Marxism. But nonetheless, they're making a very good point to say, well, society today that we look around us, that we find ourselves in is really horrid. It's, you look around and you're like, well, everyone's so materialistic. People judge each other by the value that people give you. I mean, you go to any institution and people are trying to not to say networking is bad, but rather to say that, they're people, you view people by the use that someone can give you, and you judge yourself by the use you can give other people because that's the standard everyone's working under, when none of these things ever matter. Not that they don't matter in the sense of lifestyle, because it's very easy for people to just say, I think it's a very easy temptation for pastors to fall into this and just say, well, I'm a pastor, it doesn't really matter, I'm just existing based on Christianity, and that's the only standard I need to live. I don't need to live in the world, I don't need to get job promotion, stuff like that. And you could be like, well, yeah, that's a bit idealistic. But when it comes to your life, when it comes to what really matters, the pastor has a point, the priest has a point when he says, those who love, this is found in the first epistle of John, I think. It says, if a man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And all that's of the world, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, these are not of the Father, these are of the world. And that's a really big temptation, right? Because if you think about what Christianity is saying, it's to say, well, you're valued. The most important thing is to become a saint, and nothing else really matters. I mean, of course, you need to survive, you need to feed your family, you need to provide for your family, but at the end of the day, what matters is your relationship with God, and you just don't see that in society today. Everyone views everyone else's utility, and it leads a lot of people to be depressed. It leads to a lot of sadness. I mean, I look around myself, especially in Hong Kong, which is extremely capitalistic, it's extremely materialistic, and I look around at people, and I'm like, of course people are depressed, People are judged by such ridiculous standards. I mean, there's, of course, that internet trope of people saying, well, of girls saying, "Oh, I want a guy in finance, 6'5", and then like blue eyes and whatnot. And of course, that's a bit of an extreme, but nonetheless, I think it's these memes often are representative of underlying unspoken desires of society. And you're like, well, this materialism is going to lead to nothing apart from depression and sadness. And I think Christianity provides a good alternative to that materialism. And finally, why I'm a Christian is I think there's something beautiful about the resurrection and the incarnation. There's something unique about the idea that God has come down from heaven and died for us. And this is, in some sense, on one side, an idealistic argument to say this spirit. With Hegel, he says, God is this abstract rationality, has decided to become embodied in the world, and then through the Holy Spirit has stepped into each of us. And now I'm not saying that I'm a modalist or an idealist in the same way as Hegel is. I flirt with the ideas because I think it's quite interesting, but there is still this idea of the incarnation, which is just so unique in all of history. You don't have this idea of sacrifice, of the sacrifice of God for each other. You don't get that anywhere else in the world. And it's uniquely Christian. There's something beautiful about it. And it's a bit tragic as well if you think about it, right? You read Mushkin. I think Mushkin's a very beautiful example of Dostoevsky's idiot. This guy comes into the society, people take advantage of him, and he forgives and forgives and forgives and does everything nice, and at the end of the day he fails and he dies. Well, he doesn't die, but then metaphorically he dies, he goes insane. And Christ does the same thing. People take advantage of him. No one ever sees him. The people, a prophet's never recognized in his own home. You get all of this, and he still loves, he still cares, and he dies for our resurrection. He died so that we may have life and life eternal. And that's something which is very beautiful, something very unique to the Christian message, and hope that's something we can touch upon, because, it's too easy in this world, I think, to say, well, I'm just a Christian because it's easy. But no, Christianity is fundamentally sacrificial. It's to say, you must be able to turn away from the world, turn your backs away from God, and focus on that which is important, that which is important being the role and process of you becoming a saint. And that is a very important thing, and that's something I agree with and find very, very beautiful and unique. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know it's quite a lot, quite dense, but these are some of the reasons, and probably the main reasons, why I'm a Christian. Hopefully I share this with you, give you some inspirations. Let me know why you're a Christian in the comments below. Love to hear your thoughts. See you soon. Stay safe. And God bless. See you next one.